The war in Ukraine is often presented as a sudden rupture in European peace. Yet this war is not an accident. It is the result of unresolved Cold War structures and competing security visions. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe believed that history had ended. Borders were redrawn, alliances expanded, and old rivalries were assumed to be buried forever. The idea that large-scale war could return to the continent seemed unthinkable. For many in the West, the 1990s represented a moment of historic triumph. Liberal democracy appeared uncontested. NATO and the European Union expanded eastward, not as instruments of domination, but as guarantees of stability, prosperity, and peace. For Russia, however, the same decade was experienced very differently. It was a period of economic collapse, political chaos, and dramatic loss of international status. What the West described as integration, many in Moscow perceived as retreat, humiliation, and growing strategic vulnerability. These two interpretations of the post-Cold War order never converged. They existed in parallel, quietly shaping mistrust, policy decisions, and long-term insecurity. Ukraine emerged inside this unresolved space. Independent but exposed, sovereign but pressured. Economically fragile and politically divided, Ukraine was pulled between two security systems that could not coexist. For Russia, Ukraine represented more than a neighboring state. It was a strategic buffer, a historical reference point, and a symbol of lost influence. For the West, Ukraine represented something else entirely, a sovereign country with the right to choose its political future and its place in Europe. These visions were fundamentally incompatible. For years, Ukraine survived in a fragile balance, neither fully integrated into Western institutions nor fully controlled by Moscow. It existed in a gray zone, stable enough to function, but unstable enough to fracture. History did not end in 1991, it paused. And in Ukraine, that pause would eventually come to an end. By 2015, the war in Ukraine had already entered a new and unstable phase. Crimea had been annexed, and fighting in eastern Ukraine had settled into a low-intensity conflict centered on the Donbas region. What emerged was neither peace nor full-scale war, but a fragile and dangerous stalemate. The Minsk agreements, signed in 2014 and reinforced in 2015, were intended to stop the fighting and open a political path forward. On paper, they promised ceasefires, political reforms, and reintegration. In practice, they froze the conflict without resolving its causes. Violence never fully stopped. Ceasefires were repeatedly declared and quietly broken. Ukraine remained sovereign in name, yet partially occupied in reality. Between 2015 and 2021, this frozen conflict reshaped Ukraine's strategic position. The country adapted to permanent insecurity. Its military was reorganized and trained. Cooperation with NATO deepened, even without formal membership. Western training missions expanded, and Ukraine's armed forces gradually became more capable and resilient. From Ukraine's perspective, this evolution was defensive, a matter of survival. From Russia's perspective, it represented a slow but steady loss of strategic control. The expectation that Ukraine could remain a neutral buffer faded year by year. By the early 2020s, diplomacy had stalled. Trust had evaporated. The Minsk framework had effectively collapsed, serving more as delay than resolution. From Moscow's perspective, time was no longer neutral. Ukraine was consolidating its westward orientation, politically and militarily, and the possibility of deeper integration into Western security structures no longer seemed remote. For Russia, this was not merely a geopolitical setback. It was perceived as an existential threat rooted in geography and strategic depth. Historically, Russian security doctrine relied on buffer zones. Ukraine, by location alone, was central to that logic. As negotiations failed, pressure escalated. Russian forces massed near Ukraine's borders throughout late 2021. Many believed the buildup was coercive, a show of force designed to extract concessions without war. On February 24, 2022, that assumption collapsed. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was not a limited operation. It was not confined to Donbass. It was a comprehensive assault aimed at reshaping Ukraine's political future. Missiles struck cities across the country. Armored columns advanced from multiple directions. The expectation was speed, that resistance would collapse, and the war would be short. That expectation proved catastrophically wrong. Ukraine did not collapse. It mobilized. What had been frozen in 2015 returned in full force in 2022, transforming a contained conflict into a prolonged war of attrition and exposing the unresolved fractures of the post-Cold War order. The consequences of the war in Ukraine extended far beyond the battlefield. As fighting intensified, global energy markets were disrupted, supply chains fractured, prices surged. Europe, in particular, was forced to confront long-standing dependencies that had once been treated as economic pragmatism rather than strategic risk. Food systems were affected as well. Ukraine, one of the world's major grain exporters, saw its production and exports constrained by war. The impact was felt far from Eastern Europe, contributing to food insecurity and political instability in regions already under strain. Sanctions escalated into a new form of economic warfare. Financial systems were weaponized, trade flows were redirected. What began as a regional conflict accelerated a broader fragmentation of the global economy, weakening assumptions that interdependence alone could prevent confrontation. The war also reshaped military and political thinking. Defense spending increased across Europe. Long-standing taboos around military power were reconsidered. Neutrality, once seen as stability, was reevaluated under the pressure of force. More fundamentally, the war in Ukraine challenged the foundations of the post-Cold War order. It exposed the limits of diplomacy without enforcement. It questioned the durability of international law in the face of power. And it demonstrated that historical grievances, when left unresolved, do not fade, they accumulate. This was not simply a conflict over territory or influence. It was a reminder that history does not end. It pauses, it reshapes itself, and it returns when its contradictions are ignored. The war in Ukraine became a test, not only of Ukraine's resilience, but of the international system itself. A test of whether rules could survive force, and whether stability could be rebuilt after rupture. The answer to that question remains uncertain.